Hi, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, which works to promote conversations, stories, and reflections around the spirituality of the Great Lakes, to bring a spiritual voice to the work of protecting the lakes, and to connect religious and spiritual communities that are working to protect the Great Lakes Basin and the waters that feed it. And I'm fortunate enough to be talking with Dave Dempsey today. Dave has helped shape the conversation in Great Lakes policy for 30 years and is an author, co-author of 6 conservation books. He's currently a policy advisor for FLOW, which is For Love of Water, a nonprofit environmental organization dedicated to protecting the Great Lakes waters using the public trust doctrine. Dave's past positions include environmental advisor to former Michigan Governor James Blanchard, executive director of Michigan Council on Environmental Quality, program director for the Michigan Office of Clean Water Action, policy director, senior advisor to the Michigan Environmental Council, member of the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, communications director for Conservation Minnesota, and policy advisor for the International Joint Commission. And in 2009, Dave was awarded the annual Michigan Author Award by the Michigan Center for the Book, the Michigan Library Association, and Sleeping Bear Press. That's quite a list there. Thanks, Dave, for taking some time to talk today.
Glad to do it. Look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, that's a pretty extensive record of working on protecting the Great Lakes Basin. Where did all that commitment to the lakes come from?
Well, as far as the extent of it, if you live long enough, you get a long resume. So that's why I've got it. Well, I grew up in Michigan, Southeast Michigan, and some of my earliest memories are going to the Great Lakes and the Detroit River. So it became embedded in my heart, I think, way at an early age. Professionally, and I've talked about this many times in the past, my decision to devote my career to the Great Lakes really happened as a result of what I would call a spiritual experience. I spent a couple of days with friends when I was 24 years old, doing a wilderness tour of Michigan. One of our stops was in Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore on Lake Superior. First time I ever camped, and I had this vivid memory of walking out of the tent in the morning because everybody else was still sleeping, and I had a hard time sleeping because the first night in the sleeping bag. But I got up early after I heard this rhythmic pounding of water against the base of the bluff that we were camped on, and got up there and looked out over the lake and just had this feeling that I wanted to spend my life working to protect places like that so that 500 years from now, they could still be enjoyed by people like me. So that really was where my life changed. I had previously been thinking about being an English professor, writing great novels, and smoking a pipe and wearing a tweed jacket, but suddenly it all changed.
It's funny how something like that can turn on a dime sometimes, isn't it?
It is. Nothing I ever expected. Came out of the blue. Lake Superior blue.
Well, it's funny you should mention that at a particular place like that. In 2018, Dave came out with this book, Lake Nation, People and the Fate of the Great Lakes. And in that book, you talk about, you refer to the Great Lakes as sacred places. So I was just curious why you use that particular phrase.
Well, it's, 20% of the world's fresh water. So if you looked at it simply as a natural resource, you would consider it socially sacred. We need the water, clean water for our future. But it's a special place unlike any other in the world. And I think it awakens a lot of spiritual reactions for people who live or visit the Great Lakes, live among the lakes. It comes with a sense of responsibility and stewardship that I think affects a lot of people, many of the millions who live along the Great Lakes. And but as it did with me, it just inspires a desire to protect and make sure the lakes are around for the future.
Sure. Well, that book you wrote, which I really enjoyed reading, is a series of conversations that you had with people that have experiences or connections to the lakes, talking about their background and then some of their stories, but then also how they view the future of the lakes and the work to protect them. And then Dave, you interspersed some of your own reflections in that. And I'm just curious why that book, what caused you to want to write that particular book?
it came from this perception that I've had for most of my career that everybody talks about how much they love the Great Lakes, and that includes government officials, and yet the lakes are in what the government calls fair or deteriorating condition. So how can that be when so many people care that the lakes are not doing better? And so I explored that question with a lot of the folks that interviewed in the book. My only regret is I wish I had spent more time interviewing a greater diversity of people, because there's so many different communities in the Great Lakes, and we go back and do that sometime.
So if you, yeah, for like say Lake Nation Book 2, what are some of those communities you'd like to go back and interview?
Well, it's a huge oversight is the lack of indigenous voices. Indigenous peoples are obviously rooted in the region, but they're also playing a bigger and bigger role in our political and legal system in advancing the Great Lakes through exercise of their treaty rights. And one of the things that the tribes do that I think also attracts me to the group I'm working for, which is Flow, is looking at the Great Lakes from the perspective of ethics and intergenerational ethics, wanting to protect the lakes, not just for ourselves, but for many generations to come. So that would be a major community I'd like to go back and talk to. Probably needs more business voices, people to approach the Great Lakes from a business community perspective who may also have a spiritual connection to the lakes. So those are the two that I'd like to touch base with.
Sure. Well, you know, as I went through the book, it really struck me how sometimes people would use explicit language, but oftentimes they didn't. They would sort of hint at this spiritual connection with the lakes without sort of making it blatant or official or formal in any way. I'm thinking about some of the folks that talked a little bit from, let me take that quote here. Maureen Martin was one of the people you interviewed, and she talked about the lakes open up my heart, and she uses the word wonder as she went through that. And in another place, someone you're referring to them talking about it mystically. And then also Judge Irwin Rushing was another person you interviewed, and he said, I'm hopeful for the lakes because the younger generation gives me hope, and the degree and breadth of their commitment to a belief system that assumes great balance with the natural world. So as you talk to the folks, do you think that they sort of saw a spiritual connection to the lake? Was that something that was in their mind as they talked with you?
It's true of almost everybody that I interviewed. I think that that's quite common. And I think it's true of most people, but it's, for some reason, when we get into the public policy arena, we end up talking about the dollar value of the lakes, the value of fishing and boating and things like that, which are, you know, real and tangible, but not the real reason I think that many people care about and work for the Great Lakes. It is a spiritual thing. It really is.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I loved in here, there was a couple references to this idea of reverence for the lakes. In particular, I'm thinking about, let's get my notes here. The Stephanie Prechter is a photographer you interviewed, and she said, growing up on an island in the Detroit River, I naturally developed a strong personal reverence and connection to the lakes. And then one of my favorite quotes in here was, you were talking with Nancy and Martin Auer, and they and their colleagues had a piece in the Journal of Great Lakes Research that, and this is kind of a long quote, but
Sorry about that.
Well, that's okay. We must recognize that the Great Lakes are a gift and a responsibility, kind of like what you were saying before, held in common by the peoples and the communities of the lakes. On a second level, humankind must come together as a community as representatives of the commons, bringing reverence, knowledge, experience, and insight to bear on the matters of Great Lakes management and governance. As you were talking with them, it was interesting to me that scientists sort of saw this idea of reverence. Do you run into that much because you've dealt with a lot of scientists in your work? Do you find that to be very common in the work that they're doing?
I do, but very few are willing to talk about it that way because they come out of a Western, approach to the natural world that emphasizes science, and science is very important. And sometimes in the scientific community, it's difficult to invoke spiritual values as a basis for for action. And that's why the hours appear in the book, because they're one of the few, two of the few scientists that really are willing to talk that way. It just was a kind of revolutionary to see a science journal with an article like that. But yeah, I think a lot of scientists have that as a motivation. The same that policy people do or individual citizens working on the Great Lakes do. It's kind of the platform from which many of us come.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that that people are, in terms of that sort of connection with the lakes, do they tend to think of it or put it in terms of a particular religious tradition, or does it tend to be more of a spiritual connection that they feel on an individual level and they sort of self-define that as they go along?
More of the latter, but I think that's because of the cross section of people that I usually deal with. I think there's many communities across the Great Lakes Basin, spiritual communities that do approach it from uh, their religious belief systems. And I've certainly spoken to some in the past, been invited to religious gatherings to talk about the spiritual values of the Great Lakes. So I know they're out there.
Sure, sure. Do you recall what some of those communities were that you had connected with?
Um, there were several Catholic communities. Trying to think of what else. Presbyterian, Episcopal. It's kind of hard to remember over 30. It's 35 years actually now. So, probably one a year over that time.
Sure, sure. Another person I found really interesting in this book, and I've actually quoted your book a little bit in reference to him with one of the blog posts on our Great Lakes Spirituality Project website, is a guy named Paul Parks.
Oh yeah, he was a great man.
Well, and maybe you could say a little bit more about him. The thing that just drew me was his daughter, when she talked about it and said, "My father didn't believe in God or the stock market. He believed in the state of Michigan and the Great Lakes." And he said that the lakes were everything that was right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, and praiseworthy. Michigan and the Great Lakes were his religion. He drew his comfort and meaning from them. Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that description. And I think, I think for a lot of us that holds true in terms of the depth of connection to them. But could you say a little bit more about Paul? It really intrigued me when I read about him.
Yeah, I met Paul when he was working to stop oil drilling in the Great Lakes. So I had a chance to visit him in his cottage on Lake Michigan. He was up in years, probably in his late 70s by that time, and he was not very mobile, but this is when the internet was just sort of taking hold. So he did a lot of advocacy around this issue from his living room, and he was very active. He was contacting all of his elected officials at all levels and many allies and getting them organized by the internet. What struck me about him was this long-term attachment to the lakes that he had and that his family, his kids and grandkids also had, living in this place on the Great Lakes. He was a really dear man who was pretty effective in helping contribute to the fight to stop oil drilling, which eventually was successful. But it's hard to really convey the humanity of the man and his deep love of the lakes and his willingness to sacrifice almost anything to protect them. It took a lot of his energy in his final years to do this, and I suppose to some extent it may have drained him a little bit, but he was absolutely committed to protecting this place that he had enjoyed and wanted to save for future generations.
It's amazing when you hear stories and witness people doing that, dedicating their lives like that. It really is. It's powerful. It's very powerful.
Yeah, it is. It's motivated me to keep going when I've been discouraged, because there are often a lot of discouraging moments in advocacy for the Great Lakes. But when you see people who basically get paid nothing and get a lot of hassle for working on Great Lakes issues and persist, then you've got to find the inspiration too.
Yeah, sure. So speaking of people that are working for the solutions, so what was your takeaway from the book? I mean, if you had to describe it and kind of boil it down, what conclusions did you draw from all those conversations you had with people?
Well, one thing that was interesting to me is that a lot of people had different explanations as to this gap between love and policy. Some, just said that there's a lot of cynicism amongst the public, so people don't pressure public officials. Some said that there's more focus by citizens who love the Great Lakes on a particular area that they live in, and so therefore they don't look at the whole. Some ascribed it to concern about the economy over the environment. So those were diverse themes, but what did unite people was a family or a childhood connection to the Great Lakes, this sort of visceral love of the lakes that everybody I talked to had from their youth, basically. So there were very few people who picked this up later in life, but there were many who the advocacy began in childhood.
Yeah. Given such deep connections to the lake for a lot of these people, that it was a spiritual kind of connection. Do you see spirituality playing a role, or what kind of role do you see it playing as we move forward and try to protect the Great Lakes watershed?
I think it's central. I really do. I think that the passion and persistence that people bring to the Great Lakes many times stems from spirituality. And as we develop more and more of the world, the Great Lakes are more and more precious to us. One thing that people say have told me over the years is that when you look at the surface of the Great Lakes, it's basically a wilderness area. It has not changed in 10,000 years because water remains as water. So it's got this, from a human perspective, almost a sense of eternity. It's definitely much longer and greater than the individual life. And that, I think, gives a lot of people hope in itself, and also the commitment to work on it.
Mm-hmm. You know, you as I read the book, I could, and I don't know if this is true or not, but as I was reading it, I had this sense that your hope, not that it ever went away, but it kind of went up and down depending on the conversations you were having with people about the future. But in the end, you say you're an optimist about the future of the lakes. Why is that?
Well, there's not really any choice, because if you choose not to be an optimist, it will paralyze you into inaction, which will produce or result in Great Lakes that are deteriorating. But the lakes are always a source of refreshment spiritually. When you spend a couple of days by them, then I think it naturally gives you hope and gives you the strength to carry on. Another book that I wrote that's probably my favorite is about living for a summer on Lake Huron and the feelings that brought to me. I'd always aspired to live on a Great Lake, but I couldn't afford it. But I found a rental by Lake Huron that I lived for 3 years, but I wrote a book about the experience of one summer on the lakes. And that I think tells the story of the spiritual connection that I had.
Oh, doesn't have to look for that book then. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be glad to send it to you.
Well, thanks. Well, is there anything else you want to add that we didn't get to on the conversation, Dave?
Well, I want to encourage people not to give up hope and not to refrain from participating in the policy world of the Great Lakes. It seems very alien to people, and they're very cynical about government officials' willingness to protect the lakes. But of course, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you want the lakes to be around for future generations, it does require some effort, and the effort that we often need is through the political system. That's one way. It's very important. The other way is through individual stewardship. So one can do both or one or the other, but at least pick up one strand of Great Lakes protection policy and don't give up.
That's great. That's great. Great advice. Thank you. And thanks for
Thank
making
you.
the time to talk today. We really appreciate it.
Glad to do it.